All right. Hello, Rajiv. How are you?
Hi, Glenn. I'm fine. Thank
This is
you.
Glenn Loury at the Glenn Show, bloggingheads.tv. And I'm talking today with Rajiv Sethi, professor of economics at Barnard College, Columbia University in the city of New York. I am a professor here of economics at Brown University. And Rajiv is an old friend and a frequent dialogue partner here at Blogging Heads with me. And one of the subjects that we've taken up over the last many months is the question of police-citizen interactions and the use of lethal force. And we want to spend our time today, if I can just take a moment to introduce our conversation, to talk about the case of Philando Castile and Diamond Reynolds. Now, the audience might recall that Philando Castile was the African-American man who was shot to death by a police officer in Falcon Heights, Minnesota, after a traffic stop. He was armed, Castile was, had a permit to carry the weapon, and was attempting to communicate with the officer to that effect when the officer, in what would appear to be a moment of panic and fear, shot Castile several times through the window of the automobile while his girlfriend Diamond Reynolds sat in the seat next to him, and her daughter sat in the back seat. A very famous case, notorious case that got nationwide attention. The officer was charged with manslaughter, if I'm not mistaken, and was acquitted recently by a jury. And I'll end this introduction simply by observing that after that acquittal, I became very interested in trying to look into the details of the case. How could the jury have come to that decision, I wonder? And as a part of that inquiry, I happened across at YouTube a video recording of Diamond Reynolds being interviewed by police officers immediately after this event, at a point when it was not even known what the ultimate fate of Philando Castile would be. When the interview began, they didn't know whether or not he had survived. Of course, in the end, he did not survive. And I was really taken by this interview by Diamond Reynolds, as was Rajiv, and we decided we would make that the subject of the conversation. Rajiv, do you want to sort of weigh in here and give some of your thoughts and reactions to this interview? We can get into the meat of why it is we think it's worth talking about here at Blogging Heads.
Yeah, it's a fascinating interview. As you said, it's on the night of the shooting. She finds out in the middle of the interview that he hasn't survived it, and it's really riveting. It's hard to watch. It covers a lot of ground, including marijuana possession, firearms, the kind of neighborhood she was living in, her jobs, two jobs that she held, one in the day, one at night, Castile's role in her life, and so on and so forth. It's just, it's very absorbing, very, very interesting, very emotional, as you put it, and I think we can learn something from discussing it. It's a good topic for us to take up on this show.
I was really struck by this interview. She comes off, to my mind, as a very sophisticated, highly intelligent, articulate woman. She is, now you have to recall, in police custody, not that she's been charged with anything, but she's been taken into custody for interrogation in a officer-involved shooting. And her husband, in effect, they are not legally married, but they've been together for an extended period of time and have a very close relationship, about which we'll talk more, I'm sure, has been shot multiple times and is probably, she has to imagine, dying at this moment. She's being asked about the circumstances of the event, and she is interjecting her observations and thoughts about how police are conducting themselves, about what the political ramifications of this will be, and so on. She presents herself in such an effective way, and perhaps I should, be a little bit critical of myself for being surprised at how intelligent, articulate, savvy, self-possessed, level-headed she was in the interview. But I just have to wonder whether I would have been equally in command of my faculties and able to conduct myself in such a manner. She was not in a panic in any way. Mm-hmm. And it just raised in my mind a lot of questions about the stereotypes that at least some Americans harbor about the people who are in these situations, by which I mean people of color, modest or low-income people living in high-crime areas of cities, people who are coming into contact with law enforcement in one way or another, perhaps through no fault of their own, but nevertheless given the situation, and who are the subjects of the depredations that are being criticized by movements like Black Lives Matter and others. Who are these people? Well, they're not so very different from you and I. Again, perhaps that didn't need to be said, but I think it certainly warrants to be said here. Perhaps it should have already been presumed so, but I doubt that it is. And her analysis, she was analytical in her cast of mind. Anyway, I'm talking too much and I want to stop. I'm just laying on the table some of the features of that discussion that motivated me to pass it along to you and urge us to talk about it here publicly.
Absolutely, I agree. She doesn't fit any stereotype, but also what struck me from that interview is that she paints a fairly detailed picture of Philando Castile, who also doesn't fit any stereotype of a male, in that environment, in that situation. And it's so both those facts, I think, make this an extraordinary video to watch. The implicit description of Philando Castile, who comes across as being utterly remarkable, I have to say. And she's also extremely credible. So when she describes the shooting itself, which she's asked to do on several occasions, it's, there are slight variations in the manner of conveying the account, but they're completely consistent and really, heartbreaking in any way. It was just it's just a sort of extraordinary moment of panic, as you put it, which appears to have been, really quite unwarranted. If you think about the situation, actually, you've got somebody in a vehicle, ostensibly stopped for a broken taillight, but perhaps because he fit the description of a robbery suspect. But it's an environment in which there's a 4-year-old child in the back who sort of lets herself out of her seatbelt. There's a couple sitting in the front seat. This doesn't come across as a typical robbery getaway to me. So it's just an amazing thing, and she describes this in very precise, very consistent terms throughout that interview. But the very first thing, if you recall, that she says when she enters the room, she says that she had made accusations against the officer of being racist, and for that reason they appear to have sent in a black interviewer in addition to the white interviewer, which of course he denies and probably quite correctly denies, but that's her first instinct, actually, is to observe that she's being interviewed here by one white and one black official. And she makes a point of observing that this is probably as a result of her accusations about racism. So that's where it starts, and you're right, and it's analytical all the way through. Yeah.
The visual effect of that sort of staging, the room is very stark. The interrogation room, I imagine where a camera that she may or may not be aware of is recording the event. There are the two officers, as you say, one white and one black. They look like they came right out of central casting, wearing, bad suits or, ill-fitting, whatever. They're jolly and they're middle-aged and they're nothing but the facts, ma'am, Jack Webb kind of cops who have their questions to ask. They've done this a million times before. one white and one black, as you say, and the black guy doesn't do much of the talking, but he does
No.
chime in every now and then to play his designated role in the whole affair. And here is this young African American woman who has just been victimized horribly, and there's all of the latent kind of, well, maybe he was engaged in some kind of criminal activity. Yes, marijuana was found in the vehicle, and so on. And she proceeds to testify about who this guy who had just been shot to death, as it would happen, actually was. About how long, 10 years, he had been working for the public schools of Minneapolis. About how he was such a good, although they were not legally married and he was not the father of her child, he had been such a good partner and support for her. Caring for the child. She was working 2 full-time jobs, this woman, and someone had to make sure that the kid got taken where it needed to go, got the dinner that it needed to get, got read to before it went to sleep at night, and so on. And Philando Castile was that guy. They'd been together off and on, mostly on, for 10 years. He had no record. He had a permit to carry the weapon that he was carrying. This guy's death was an absolute tragedy. I mean, this was a good man by any accounts, notwithstanding the fact that he spoke a ghetto dialect of the English language, and most likely notwithstanding the fact that he was a young African-American man, notwithstanding the fact that he liked to smoke a little marijuana from time to time. A lot of people do, I'm told. His death was a tragedy. Again, I am probably just stating the obvious, but anybody can find this video. Just go to YouTube and search.
Yes, I suspect that her life must have really fallen apart. And there's no way she could have held down those 2 jobs. So she had a job at the Embassy Suites in the daytime, and then she went to, I think it was Family Dollar after that. He would take her from one job to another. He would read to the child at night. The little girl was born. She was 4 years old. She was born during an interruption of a 10-year relationship between Castile and Diamond Reynolds. She was very open about that. But the way in which he took care of this child, the way in which he shuttled her from one job to another, held down his own full-time job, did errands for her sister, driving her sister. They had just come from dropping her sister off somewhere. It just seemed like, it seemed to me like her life must have really fallen apart, quite apart from the emotional toll that the death would have taken. It just seems inconceivable to me that she could take care of a child, hold on 2 jobs, and just find the physical energy and the time to do what she was previously doing when she was supported, by Castile, when they were supporting each other, in effect. But what's interesting, Glenn, is the conversation, the way in which she discusses marijuana and the way in which she discusses guns is completely fascinating. I think we should spend a little bit of time. She's completely not defensive. They talk about the fact that there was marijuana found in the vehicle, and she's completely open about it. And she says, "Yes, we like to smoke. There are smokers. There are doctors and lawyers who are smokers. What? So what? It's really extraordinary. There is no reluctance to admit to something that is, quite clearly illegal at this time. Whether it should be or not, we can debate. But she's not defensive about it. She's not trying to hide it at all, which to me makes the testimony about the killing itself that much more credible.
I think one of her jobs brought her into contact with lawyers or doctors, I don't remember which, but with a group of professionals, and she was there to report that a lot of the people that she works with who have these doctorate degrees or these law degrees smoke.
Which is true. And it is absolutely true.
In other words, you're finding that marijuana in my car does not in any way discredit me. There is no way that it could possibly legitimate that officer behaving in the way in which he did. It may be technically against the law, but it's a law that's honored mostly in the breach around here these days. And I'm not on the defensive because you found marijuana in my car. I really admired that.
I thought it
not
was fantastic.
not
Yeah,
mainly because I might smoke marijuana or I might not. I'm not confessing to anything, but because
yeah,
her dignity
absolutely.
was not compromised in the least.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's what I meant by saying she wasn't defensive, but that's absolutely right. She was completely, yeah. It was a phenomenally interesting response. I think and a lovely response in some ways. But even more interesting, I would say, was the discussion of guns. Why he had a firearm, and the fact that he took her to a driving range, that he had her rent a weapon, to develop proficiency in the use of firearms. The fact that two people had been killed in her backyard, she mentioned that he was really making sure that he and she and the child were in a sense protected. Now we can argue about the wisdom of getting getting a license, securing a firearm, going to a range and training with it. As a response to that situation, but it's certainly understandable and it's very, very logical the way in which she describes it. It's, again, like I said, it just shatters a whole lot of stereotypes. This is the kind of behavior that that the NRA actually extols. Weapons for self-defense, going to a range, being proficient in their use. It's just, this is one of the. This has been observed many times, but it's shocking that the NRA has not jumped to the defense of this
Well,
young man.
he should be a poster boy for
It
the
should be.
NRA.
I know,
He
it
is
should be.
he is a law-abiding citizen. Let's put the marijuana on the side. Who has armed himself for self-defense, which is exactly what the NRA argues. Who has had his life taken, not
That's
just
right.
by a police officer, who in effect, negated his right to bear arms and to defend himself.
Yeah, I can't, I can't make sense of the failure of the gun rights folks to defend this person, other than to count on race. I mean, other than the.
Interrupting, but a hypothesis suggests itself. Okay,
Yes,
which
yes,
is that
exactly.
the latent demand for firearms for self-protection for many of the devotees of the National Rifle Association derives from their fear of, quote, black crime, close quote.
Right, right.
Now, here is a, quote, black criminal, close quote, or proto-criminal, or potential criminal, or looks like a criminal.
Right.
He's not a poster boy for our movement because he's the guy that we're arming ourselves against. And if not him, then his cousin or his brother.
Yeah, yeah. I see that, of course. I was, what I meant was I couldn't see any sort of legitimate or consistent or intellectually honest reason for them to fail to defend. Yes, yes. But what you're pointing out is, yeah, I agree with that 100%.
We're smart.
Yeah.
They might have seized upon this as an opportunity to make further inroads into a potential constituency, which are people living in high crime areas of central cities who are victimized by the criminals there. I mean, there are high homicide rates or rising homicide rates in lots of American central cities. It's been getting much attention in recent years. And those are largely black and Latino areas. And these are Americans who need to be protected from violent criminals, some of whom want to take matters into their own hands. Again, as you say, you can question the wisdom of that, but the sort of intuition that that's a way in which a number of people are going to want to respond is pretty compelling to me. It seems like the NRA might have picked up on that.
Yeah, and the logic is, the logic that is used to defend, firearms possession, training, etc., is precisely and very effectively communicated by Diamond Reynolds in this interview. She makes the case, basically, implicitly. I mean, it's not, a lot of the conversation, really the most interesting aspects of it come out, through digressions and so on. So these are digressions in the conversation, which is really about what transpired on that particular day. But she's very, very precise, very effective in communicating this rationale for this. Why should he have been?
going to be big turmoil about this. You know, this is going to be in the news all over the country. I mean, she's very keenly aware. Indeed, I suppose we shouldn't be as surprised by that in view of the fact that she had the presence of mind to pull out her phone and begin video recording the scene almost immediately after Philando Castile was shot by the police officer. And again, that's not something I'm sure I would have thought to do.
Well, let me speak to that a little bit. So I'm sure that when this recording between the two of us goes live, a few people are going to respond with various other videos of Diamond Reynolds that are out there online, as they did in response to your Facebook post. And in fact, she was a frequent user, as many people are, of Facebook Live. So she would post videos live of herself, partying or performing. And these are performance videos in some sense. And there's one in particular that where she and Castile presumably are listening to music, smoking weed, listening, on the 4th of July, it seems to me, with fireworks going off around them, and this
little shorts and whatever, and she shows her body off as she smokes the marijuana and laughs into the camera.
Yeah, and performs, and she's singing to the she's rapping along with the music. So this was a more automatic reaction for her than it would be for you and I. We use Facebook. I hardly ever do, but we use it in a different way. Posting live videos of oneself is something. If one does it routinely, then it's understandable why it may have happened in this situation. She just thought to do it right away. So I think those two things are linked. We should also at some point, I think, speak to whether or not these other videos that are out there, and in fact her arrest for aggravated assault, which also was mentioned when you posted the interrogation video on Facebook. Whether these things are actually relevant to the way in which we interpret the interrogation itself or the broader case. I have a few thoughts on that, but we can do that later if you like.
I was going to speak to that in a sense because I think it's pertinent to this larger issue of, although her style of self-presentation, her cultural orientations and so forth may be of the sort that one would associate with somewhat seamy or underside of inner city life, nevertheless, here was an upstanding woman, here was an intelligent and articulate woman, here was a rightly aggrieved and victimized woman who was able to keep her head and react under pressure in an extraordinary way, and that's worth noting. And to me, that's all the more worth noting in view of the fact that she turns out not to be, sort of picture perfect middle American innocent. Okay, she's a little risque. She's got a little bit of an edge to her, And I don't know the facts of this assault charge, and I'm not making any brief for Diamond Reynolds in that respect. I'm simply saying, though, that does not in any way, it seems to me, detract from the quality of her reaction to that stressful situation.
Yes, I agree with that completely. Although, I agree with that, and also it should be mentioned that she's entered a plea of not guilty to the assault charge, and claims that cell phone evidence puts her at a different location. So we'll see what comes of that. But the reason I mentioned it is because you sent me a link. Actually, the link I believe is in the comments to your Facebook post on this issue. But the link itself describes somebody who's very concerned that this charge will have a bearing on the case. Now, this was before the officer himself was acquitted of manslaughter. But the point of view taken in the video was that this could affect the outcome. Whether it did or not, I don't know.
I understand. I actually haven't got firsthand knowledge of this. This is something someone told me who might be more familiar with the case, that her performance in the courtroom turned out not to be entirely credible, that she contradicted herself in under cross-examination. This was exposed to the jury. And so not so much the fact that she had an outstanding charge for assault as the fact that she simply wasn't a very good witness, and perhaps because she wasn't entirely consistent in the set of things that she had been saying, having been interviewed several times prior to the trial. But the jury acquitted this police officer of the manslaughter charge. What are we to make of that?
Well, on the one hand, it's very difficult to get a conviction if an officer can credibly argue that he was in fear, even if not everyone in that situation would have been in fear. Even if one might think that he really ought not to have been in fear, given the fact that there's a 4-year-old child in the back, this is not the robbery suspect that you're looking for. It's very, very hard to get a conviction. Under those circumstances, the legal standard is such that as long as my understanding, I'm not a lawyer, of course, but my understanding is that as long as there is a credible communication that he was actually in fear.
I think the standard is that a reasonable person would have feared for their lives under the circumstance.
Well, look, in my view, a reasonable person really ought not to have. But I don't know. I don't know. You see, one case. I mean, it's worth thinking about this other case that happened in September 2014 in South Carolina, and that was the shooting of LeVar Jones. He was a gentleman who had just stepped into a white pickup van after work. And he just drove into a gas station, just drove around the corner without a seatbelt, into a gas station, was stopped by an officer, asked to get his license and registration. He reached back into the vehicle to get that and was immediately shot several times. He survived that, and that video is online. That's a high quality video in the sense that the events, unlike the Castile case where the video only captures the aftermath of the shooting, this is a video that captures the shooting itself and the build-up to it. And it's interesting, in that situation, the officer was dismissed. And in fact, I believe that he pled guilty in the end to some fairly serious charges. And the statement dismissing him from the South Carolina Department of Public Safety said that he perceived a threat when there was none. I'm paraphrasing here. I wrote about this on my blog, I think, under the title "Threats Perceived When There Are None." And so that was a case in which it was judged. The officer, it did not appear to me, had any malice towards this person, but clearly was fearful when there was really no justification for it. Started shooting. He was hit. LeVar Jones was hit in the hip. He survived that, but of course was badly hurt. And in that case, the fear defense obviously was not enough. Being fearful is not enough. You're right. You have to be justifiably fearful, I imagine. And so in this case, I
described it in the interview. His weapon was in the side pocket. His wallet was in the back pocket. The wallet is bulky and difficult to remove from the pocket because, as she says, and it's almost a little humorous, she doesn't understand why, but he just wants to put everything in that wallet. Okay, so his gun license is in that wallet, and Lord knows what else is in that wallet. The wallet is overstuffed, and it's difficult to get out. The gun is bulging in his side pocket, and it's in a holster. He's trying to reach behind himself with his left hand, I assume, to get the wallet out of his back pocket so he can show the officer his license and registration or his license to carry or both. But his hand has to go past the weapon, which is bulging in the side pocket, in order to do that. And he's already notified the officer that he has a weapon in his possession, which he's licensed to carry. The officer apparently at some point panics or becomes especially alarmed and begins shouting commands at him to not go for the weapon, not go for the weapon. Of course, he's not going for the weapon. He's going for his wallet in his back pocket, which is difficult to remove, but which he needs to remove in order to respond to the officer's prior command to present his documentation. Yeah, and it's in that setting that the officer starts shooting.
Yeah, it's important to note that all of this happens in a flash. I mean, the way that he describes it is that he asks for it and he declares that he has he's trying to reach for his wallet. He's having difficulty, as you said, right? And the gun is holstered, and I don't know if it's in his pocket or in his belt, but it's in the way. It's concealed. There's absolutely, she's adamant that he cannot view the weapon, that the officer cannot view the weapon. And he's having trouble, and he tells the officer that he has a weapon. And the way Diamond Reynolds tells it in this interrogation is that the officer then responds by saying, don't move, bam, bam, bam. I mean, it's instant. It's prior. It would be impossible to respond to the command before the gunshots come. It seems to me the way that she describes it, it's just instantaneous almost. That the command for him. He's previously asked for his license and registration. Now he's asked not to move, but he's shot before he can even, really process what he's being told he should do. And the whole thing is just really, really, really terrible, I think. It's just terrible. I just don't... It does not appear, so let me put it this way. It appears to me that, the presence of a firearm, the appearance of Philando Castile, perhaps the description of some robbery suspect that he was told about, become vastly more salient than the 4-year-old child in the back and the passenger. They are almost invisible. And this phenomenon is really driving things to me.
So let's try to look at it from the cop's point of view, which I assume is what this jury of 12 people, including 2 African Americans, if I'm not mistaken, a jury that came unanimously to the conclusion that the officer should not be found guilty. And I assume that they would too have to try to put themselves in the officer's position.
Yeah.
So does he or does he not resemble the robbery suspect? Maybe all that he knew about the robbery suspect was that he was black, a young man of a roughly age range and of a roughly body type. And, so he thinks he might be dealing with someone who's a criminal. He's been told that the person is armed. He smells marijuana in the car, or so he alleges, and marijuana was later found in the car. And he is giving commands that he feels, it perceives, are not being responded to. And he is in fear of his life. Is it unreasonable to imagine that, I don't know, if you or I were in that situation, this is a very dangerous situation for a police officer, pulling a vehicle over at night in a place where he might have reason to think that the criminal activity is ongoing. He's stereotyping for sure. If it's an older white woman, he's probably not afraid. Even if she tells him that she has a weapon, he's probably not afraid in the same way. Why don't the female passenger and the child in the back allay his fears? I can't answer that. It does seem to me that they ought at least to have dialed them down a bit, but that jury, in coming to the not guilty conclusion that they came to, basically have endorsed, at least from their point of view, the reasonableness of the officer's behavior under the circumstance. Which makes me want to think of this as people say he murdered him. I almost want to say this was just a tragic. We should be thinking about how to prevent these tragedies for sure, in terms of the training of officers and all of that. But this is just a kind of tragic and terrible calamity that befell Castile and Diamond Reynolds. Not necessarily a manifestation of some, what did Castile's mother is quoted in something as saying, that we are hunted, we are being hunted. And people who've been following me here at Blogging Heads know that I've been a little bit reluctant to jump on the bandwagon about the police are a racist, occupying force in black communities who are hunting down our people. I think the situation is more complicated than that. But this case just breaks my heart. It breaks my heart.
There are two folks following this case who said that Philando Castile would not have been dead if he had been white. One was the governor of Minnesota, Mark Dayton. He got a lot of grief for that.
Sure, it's plausible. It's a very plausible claim.
And the other actually was a guest on your show, Peter Moscos, who is a former police officer, and I believe who is quite credible on these matters. I find his blog, very informative and fair. Actually, he doesn't always stand by the police story.
Let me just tell people that's Peter Moscos, Moskos, of the John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City, whose blog, Cop in the Hood, is an extremely informative source of data and observations about policing in inner city communities. He's a former Baltimore City police officer himself.
And a sociologist, I believe, by training, right? Princeton, yeah.
I don't know what they call the degree when you serve for a year on the streets of Baltimore as a beat cop, but it's certainly an education.
That's right. And so both of these folks, Mark Dayton and Peter Moscos, claimed that Castile would not have been dead had he been white. Now, let's try to think about that from the perspective of the jury. Is it reasonable to fear other things equal? Now, I know that, other things are never always equal. But, 4-year-old child in the back, there's a young woman in the passenger seat. You smell marijuana, let's say. The person matches a robbery suspect, and about 40 to 45% of robberies in the United States by victim surveys have white offenders. So it's common, right? A white male robbery suspect. Imagine the situation, being the same except for the race of a driver, passenger, and child. If Dayton and Moscos are right in saying that things would have transpired very differently, given that they had the gun, given that there's difficulty reaching the wallet, etc., then in what sense is the fear reasonable? This is a tough question. I mean, I think that I'm just wondering whether the jury...
Well, it seems to me this is really a question about when is racial... I mean, you're starting with the premise, taking it for granted, and I'm not disputing it, that if Castile had been white, he'd be alive today.
I'm saying that if the jury believed that, suppose that the jury believed that,
I just want to make my point. Suppose the jury believed that Castile being black contributed materially to him being dead.
Yes.
How could they nevertheless acquit the officer?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And
can one? So let me just pose the question, and then can one simultaneously believe that Castile would have been alive had he been white, and that the officer acted reasonably? Yeah. That's my question.
That's equivalent to asking, is it ever reasonable to racially profile? To have one's estimate, even if only implicit, of the character of the danger that one faces, being a police officer pulling a vehicle over, influenced by racial information. Is that reason? It seems to me that those are equivalent questions. He was more afraid, I think, we speculate, of course, but because it's a counterfactual, but it's not unreasonable speculation. He was more afraid in that situation with a black person behind the wheel of the vehicle than he would have been had there been a white person behind the wheel of the vehicle. The jury well might believe that. I think I believe it. So now, is that inconsistent with reason, with him being reasonable? And I'm imagining him making a calculation, if not consciously, then, in the back of his mind that the rate of violent crime in this community is considerably higher among blacks than it is among whites. So the conditional probability that this person is a bad actor, given that he's black, is a higher number than it would be given that he's white, just based upon some kind of statistical calculation. And so I've got a threshold. I behave in a threshold manner. If the probability that the person is a bad actor gets above a certain level, that triggers my more aggressive response, and that level is below the estimate if the person is black, but above the estimate if the person is white. Yeah. Some kind of decision theoretic reasoning of that sort. Right. And I don't see anything unreasonable in that. It may be immoral. It may be wrong to reason in such a way, but it doesn't obviously strike me as illogical or irrational to reason.
Right, that's right. And yet our laws don't allow really, or disallow, that kind of reasoning in various circumstances, right? The idea that you must have probable cause for an invasive search or reasonable suspicion for stop and frisk, and you have to articulate. So it has to be reasonable, articulable suspicion, and you cannot say it can't be race. It can't be. It can be based on race, for instance, if the race of the individual you're stopping matches the race of the suspect. But by hypothesis, we are looking at a situation where the robbery suspect, was white as well, right? So in terms of articulable suspicion, right? We are saying that if you had the same level of articulable suspicion in these cases, can a jury? So my question is really, does the jury disagree with Mark Dayton and Peter Moskos and think that this person would have been guilty if he were white? Or do they agree and don't consider that to be sufficient in order to find the officer guilty?
I think we should ask them. And not only them, I think there's a very good academic study here. I read a book some time ago that really had a big impact on me called Jurors' Stories of Death. Mm-hmm. Jurors' Stories of Death. And the author's name will occur to me. I could look it up right now, but I don't want to take the time to do that.
Yeah.
But anyone who's interested could find this book and the author, who's a sociologist, trained at Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts. And what he did was he interviewed hundreds of death penalty jurors, mm-hmm. and just had them narrate what was their reasoning in the particular case in which they had served as jurors, and coming to the conclusion of voting as they did vote, usually affirmatively in capital cases for the death penalty. Mm-hmm. And it was a very enlightening experience to read this book, because what he, gosh, I almost thought of his name, what he discovers is that many of the jurors have first to tell themselves stories about the defendant that puts the defendant outside of the orbit of kind of human decency. They have to construct in their minds the person who's been convicted now. He's been convicted of murder. And we're at the punishment phase, and the jury is deliberating on whether the penalty should be death or whatever, and hearing witnesses on that. They have to somehow come to the conclusion that this is a person beneath contempt, a person whose humanity is suspect, a person who was monstrous. And once having so perceived the defendant, it then becomes possible, or maybe even necessary, to kill him. And some of the bases, this is anecdotal now, this is all anecdotal, some of the bases upon which jurors reach this conclusion about the humanity of the defendant are as flimsy as they could possibly be. So in one case, the defendant's mother comes into the courtroom to testify on behalf of her child. Please don't kill my son. He did something terrible, but he's not a terrible person. Don't kill him. Life in prison should be enough. She comes to testify. The defendant doesn't look at his mother, according to the report, when she comes into the courtroom. One of the jurors says, what kind of guy wouldn't even look at his mother? What kind of person, he has no conscience whatsoever. He wouldn't even look his mother in the eye when she came into the courtroom to beg for his life. And I thought when I read that, well, my God, the juror has no idea what the relationship between this man and his mother might have been. Has no idea what neglect or abuse the mother might have subjected him to. I don't know that she did. I don't know that she didn't. And neither does the juror. The juror is searching, it seemed to me, for a reason to so conclude. Anyway, I go on too long about this. I simply want to say that I would love to know what jurors in cases of this kind have to say to each other. After the case has been decided, they can be providing their information anonymously. I'm not saying that, we need to open up and embarrass people and all like that. But I really want to know something about the psychodynamics of jury deliberations in cases like this. There were black people on that jury. I mean, many questions arise. If the jury had been all white, of course, the verdict would have been perceived widely as illegitimate. Does it matter that there were black people on the jury and that they came to this conclusion? I mean, this is another kind of racial profiling question, isn't it? Is a juror's race relevant to their capacity to carry forward a deliberation? Should our willingness to accept the jury's outcome depend upon the racial composition of the jury and so on?
I mean, yeah, these are questions without easy answers. Intuitively, it seems as if, yes, the presence of two African Americans on the jury adds legitimacy to the verdict. Delving deeper into exactly why or what they went through. Yeah, that's harder. It's a very tough case. I mean, of course, we as viewers, we can be saddened by it and exhausted in some sense by it. But of course, the Reynolds and her daughter and Philando Castile, went through an unspeakable horror.
He said here loud and clear, Philando Castile was no thug.
Not at all.
Philando Castile, by all accounts, was a good and decent human being, and whose loss of life was an absolute travesty, if not a crime. And the fact that he was black, and the fact that they were smoking marijuana in his car, and the fact that they might like to listen to rap music, and the fact that he wasn't married to the woman with whom he had been living for 10 years, and the fact that he might have spoken the English with a certain spoken the language with a certain black English inflection, have no bearing whatsoever upon his decency or upon his humanity. And we mustn't lose track of the humanity of people who find themselves trapped in this kind of a situation.
Yeah, to me, actually, I would go even further. To me, he was a man of uncommon decency, extraordinary generosity. Really, really hard to imagine. I mean, I find it quite hard to imagine, to tell you the truth, that if I was involved with somebody for 10 years and they had a child during an interruption of that relationship, with an man, and then for me to take that child and as my own, to read to her, to facilitate my partner's ability to keep and hold these two jobs, which it seems to me were difficult jobs, not especially rewarding jobs. And then, he, by all accounts, he was very much liked in his workplace. The whole picture that emerges of Castile from this interview and from other sources is of a man of uncommon decency. I would say I was just struck by that. No matter how credible one thinks of Diamond Reynolds as a witness, and to me she seemed extremely credible, but her character is not really relevant to our evaluation of him. I just think he's exceptional.
A final observation. I wonder if you picked up on this. Our guys from Central Casting, that was the Salt and Pepper police officer team who were doing the interrogation, at one point report to her that he is probably not going to make it. I don't remember the exact words, that they use,
Yeah.
but his condition is referred to. They have information about it, and
Yeah.
it is grave. He's not going to make it. So they tell
Yeah.
her this, and she has this outburst of grief in which she wails.
Yeah.
And
Yes, she does.
again, like I say, if you were trying to do a stage play or a movie of something like this, you couldn't do better than create the scene, which is at that moment, because these guys don't know what to say to her at that moment. And a long time goes by, as I recall, before anybody says, "I'm sorry"
Right.
to her.
Right.
It actually made me a little bit uncomfortable that they seemed unable to comfort her. Not that she would have necessarily accepted any comfort from them, but I was there sitting, waiting. When is somebody going to say, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry"?
Yeah,
To
that's
this
right.
woman.
In fact, my recollection is that they tell her that he has in fact died, and she wails for, yeah, she's just yeah, yeah, and she just wails, and there's a lot of silence, and then after the silence, after some uh, you know after the moment has passed, then they step back into the routine, right? It's the interrogation continues, yeah, and they go back to, okay, can you describe the events one more time? And it is. Yeah,
Moments to gather yourself, or can we get you something, or whatever.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's another very remarkable feature of this. I hope that the viewers of your show will just take the time. It's time to watch it. It's about I think 35 minutes or so long. But it's riveting. Like I said, I couldn't take my eyes off it.
Thanks very much, Rajiv, for just giving us some time and talking about this, the Glenn Show. I really appreciate it, friend.
My pleasure, Glenn.
Okay.